Hello, welcome to another GCSE history lesson. We are on the Viking expansion unit and we're on the topic of settlers. Last lesson we looked at the first half of settlement in the North Atlantic. So if you haven't done that lesson, go back and do the lesson that looks at Iceland, because this lesson is a follow-on from that lesson where we're going to look at Greenland and North America. Before we start, let's do the low stakes quiz. There are your 5 questions. Pause the video now and answer those questions, please. Okay, welcome back. If you haven't finished the quiz, pause the video again. I'm going to go through the answers now. There are your answers. Let me pay some special attention to number 3, the Althing. Remember the Thing? That was like the meeting of Jarls in the homeland in Scandinavia. The Althing is the special assembly of Jarls which ruled Iceland, which took place once a year at that big rock. They sorted out all their disagreements so they didn't become violent, and they took important decisions like the decision to convert to Christianity in the year 1000. Pause if you need more time to correct your answers. I'm going to move on to the next slide. Okay, so in the last lesson, we looked at Viking settlement, this island in the North Atlantic called Iceland. Today we're going to see how the Vikings went on to Greenland and North America. So from Iceland, the Vikings went on to this really large area of land here called Greenland. I'm going to tell you the story of Greenland and the Viking settlement in Greenland. And then we're going to fill in some notes together, so you don't need to write anything at the moment. The settlement of Greenland started with a criminal. Eric the Red, I think he was called Eric the Red because of his beard, that would make sense, was banished from Iceland by the Althing. He's sent away from the island because apparently, allegedly, he had murdered some fellow settlers. Eric the Red took advantage of this opportunity that he'd been given, and he set sail westwards. And at some point, he made landfall. He landed in this huge expanse of land, Greenland. He started a settlement that was going to remain for decades. Now, Greenland has got the wrong name, really, because it's not green. In fact, Iceland is not that icy. In fact, Iceland's quite green. Greenland is really icy, and it's not green at all. In fact, we think probably Eric the Red called it Greenland because he wanted to encourage people to come and settle there. So he's like, yeah, it's a green land. Everything's really green and great. You can grow crops here and you can have your animals. It's not cold at all. But actually, when people got there, they realized it was really cold, as you can see in this image here. However, and this is absolutely crucial, on the southern and western coasts, so I'm pointing to these here, right, the southern and western coasts, there was some fertile land. Because of the climate, particular climate here on this part of Greenland, there was some fertile land, and on that land, Viking settlers were able to grow crops. Remember, the problem in Iceland was that there was no fertile land. The problem in Scandinavia is that there wasn't enough fertile land. And now in Greenland, Eric the Red, the criminal, had found some fertile land. As well as the fertile land, there were other hunting opportunities. Our old friend the walrus. The walruses, they lived around the coast of Greenland, and of course they could be hunted, and the Greenlanders, or the Greenland Vikings, they could sell and exchange, trade their tusks, walrus ivory, for other important goods. The other exciting resident of Greenland was the polar bear. Just like the walrus, the polar bear is huge and quite scary, and must have been quite difficult to hunt with sort of spears and swords and so on. But hunt it, the Vikings did, and one thing we know about the polar bears is they got really thick fur, and that fur must be very warm, right? Because they spend all their time in the ice. And so the Vikings hunted the polar bears for their fur, and they could exchange this fur with other people who lived in other places who'd never seen a polar bear before, and would pay loads and loads and loads of money for a nice polar bear fur to wear. So just like in Iceland with the walrus, in Greenland, the Viking settlers hunted animals to get goods to trade. Despite this, despite the fertile land and the animals, the Greenland settlers always relied on imports, that's goods coming into Greenland, of food, of metal, and of wood from Iceland and Scandinavia. So in other words, the Greenland settlers would have starved and gone without homes unless boats arrived from Iceland all the time with food, because there wasn't enough fertile land, of metal, because there were no metals in Greenland to make swords, for example, and wood. There weren't enough trees in Greenland. That wood had to come all the way from Scandinavia via Iceland. So even though the Greenlanders had these valuable goods they could trade, they had to trade them for food, metal, and wood because they didn't have any of that themselves. There was never a point that the Greenland settlers could make it on their own. They are always reliant on the people in Iceland to keep them supplied. And when these imports stopped after 100 years, the Vikings were forced to leave Greenland. So unlike the settlement in Iceland, which lasts up to the present day, the settlement in Greenland, after a while, frittered away because it relied on imports from Iceland, and after a while, the Iceland Vikings stopped sending those imports. So, grab your pens. In your books last time, we started to make a table that looked like this, or at least we did the first row about Iceland. I'd like you to rule off underneath Iceland. And if you weren't here for the last lesson or you don't think you've got enough space, you can just start the table again, but start it with Greenland. So rule off under Iceland, put Greenland like that in the left-hand column. And then what I'd like you to do, think about the story of Greenland. What's the evidence of success in Greenland? What went well for the Greenlanders? And then on the other side, why did the Greenland settlement fail? What was the problem that the settlers in Greenland had? Pause the video now. It really should only take 2 or 3 minutes. Off you go. Okay, welcome back. Grab your purple pens because it's really important that you've got the right notes down here. So, in Greenland, evidence of success. What do you need? You need to say that in southern and western Greenland there was fertile land. You've got a point about fertile land, absolutely brilliant. If you can add in with your purple pen that it was in the south and the west of Greenland, brilliant. You also need to say that the Vikings hunted polar bear and walrus to get fur and ivory. Make sure you've got both the polar bears and the walrus in there. But then also you need something on the failure side that if you can use this word, relied. Greenland relied on imports from Iceland and Scandinavia, food, metal, and wood. Make sure you've got all those details in, please. And then, of course, this meant that eventually the Vikings were forced to leave. Pause the video now. Make sure you've got all these notes down in your book, all the key details before we move on. Okay, welcome back. Going to move on from this slide. So if you need a bit longer, pause, please. Right, here's our practice. 5 answers. You write me 5 questions. And then, just like before, I want you to complete the sentences. So on one hand, settlement of Greenland was successful because, on the other hand, it was not successful because. Use your table to help you. It should take you 5 or 6 minutes. Off you go. Pause the video, please. Okay, welcome back. Pause the video again if you need more time. I'm going to show some answers now. Here are my questions for task 1. You may have slightly different questions, that's fine, but if you couldn't get one, write in mine with your purple pen. And then the sentences. So on one hand, the settlement of Greenland was successful because the Vikings discovered fertile land on the southern and western coasts. And this meant that the Greenland Vikings could grow food to survive, although not enough as it turned out. Because on the other hand, the settlement of Greenland was not successful because the settlers always needed imports of food, metal, and wood that came from Iceland and Scandinavia. And when these imports stopped, the Vikings were forced to leave Greenland. It wasn't that successful, right? Because they couldn't make it on their own. They needed support from other parts of the Viking world. Pause this video now so you can use this slide to use your purple pen to fill in any gaps that you might have. Okay, going to move on from this slide, so pause if you need to. Okay, so where are we in our story? The Vikings came from Scandinavia. They went to the British Isles, Ireland and Normandy. At the same time, they headed to Iceland and settled in Iceland, and we've just seen how for a short period of time they settled in Greenland as well with Eric the Red. The final part of our saga takes us all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to North America. And we've got archaeological evidence of Viking settlement in this part of North America, which is in northern Canada. And as I said at the beginning of last lesson, this is hugely important because for a long time, you probably have heard the name Christopher Columbus. What Christopher Columbus is allegedly famous for is sailing from Spain and discovering, quote marks, North America in 1492. Now, there were lots of people, Native Americans, who already lived in North America, and they probably had discovered themselves before that. But Columbus said, I'm the first European to get to America. That wasn't true. That he wasn't to know it. Vikings had got there 500 years before him. How did they do it? And what happened when they arrived? Put your pens down, let me tell you the story. Remember Eric the Red, the criminal who had settled in Greenland. Now, Eric the Red, something about his genes, something about his fathering style. Well, he had a son called Leif Erikson. Leif Erikson was Eric the Red's son. That's why he's called Eric's son. Get it? See how this is working? And he set sail further west. He wanted to show that he wasn't going to live in his father's shadow his whole life, but he was going to set out and discover somewhere for himself. He set sail further west and he settled in North America. When Leif arrived in North America, he called the area where he settled Vinland. Vinland is kind of the Norse word, means wine land. Now, why did he call it wineland? Well, there's no evidence at all that the Vikings were able to grow any crops, let alone grapes, which need lots of warm weather, lots of sun, and lots of rain. There definitely wasn't warmer weather in North America. You can't, in this part of North America, you can't grow grapes there. So it's likely that just like his father had called Greenland Greenland to try and encourage people to come to this amazing land of green fields, Leif, he called the settlement in North America Vinland or Wineland because he wanted people to think that he was growing wine there, and therefore what a lovely place it would be to come and settle. So again, he was trying to do a marketing job, an advertising job to other Vikings by calling it Vinland. So already we've got problems. He's having to lie about what it's called, and we've got no evidence that they were able to grow crops there. However, there were, unlike in Greenland and in Iceland, we think, there were people who Leif Erikson came into contact with. Leif Erikson came into contact with Native Americans, people who lived in America before Europeans arrived. It's likely that these people who Leif Erikson came into contact with were a part of the Inuit people or ancestors of the Inuit people, people who you might think of like as Eskimos today. At first, Leif Erikson and the Native Americans got on pretty well. They traded peacefully with each other. We don't know this is for sure, but we imagine that the Native Americans probably had things that Leif Erikson, who'd been on a boat for weeks and weeks on end, needed. And he probably had things, polar bear furs, walrus ivory, for example, that maybe the Native Americans wanted. And so they were able to trade quite peacefully. However, this did not last. Relations with the Native Americans got worse. There was fighting between Native Americans and Vikings. And eventually, the Native Americans forced the Vikings to leave after just 20 years. This is the least successful of the settlements. It lasted for just 20 years. And despite initially being friendly with the Native Americans, eventually relations got worse. Okay, let's fill in the last row of this table. You need more space. You could start the table again, but we're going to put in a subheading North America. And just like you've done before, I want you to tell me what's the evidence that things were going well in North America, the evidence of success. And then on the other side, why did things fail in North America? What was the problem? I want you to pause the video now, just 2 or 3 minutes, jot down your ideas. How much detail could you include? Off we go. Okay, welcome back. If you need more time, pause the video again. Let's go through what you should have written down. So you can use your purple pen to help me with this. So on the evidence of success side, just one bullet point really. You just need to say that at first or initially, Leif Erikson and his Vikings, they traded peacefully with the Native Americans. But that's really the only thing you're going to have on this side. On the other side, not able to grow crops, despite calling it Vinland, wineland, you weren't able to grow grapes or actually any crops in North America. And then, yeah, of course, despite friendly relations at first, relations with the Native Americans got worse, and the Vikings were eventually forced to leave after just 20 years. So you can pause the video here to finish, make sure you got all the detail in on both sides of that table, and then let's do some practice. So here's your practice. Task 1, just as usual, you write me the questions that's going to give me those 4 answers. Then there's on the one hand, on the other hand, about the success. This is going to take you 5 or 6 minutes. Pause the video now, unpause when everyone's done. Okay, welcome back. Pause if you need more time. Here's my questions. Here's my sentences. Pause the video now so that we can check through our answers. Okay, welcome back. Pause if you need more time on this slide. We're going on to our last practice task. Here are 8 words or key bits of specific detail that I would like definitions of. I want you to write them down in your books, and I want you to write down the definitions afterwards. Pause the video now, see how many definitions you can get, come back when you're done. Okay, I'm going to put up my definitions. So pause if you need more time. Here are my definitions. This is the last activity in this lesson. If you've got any spare time, you could use it recapping, setting yourself self-quizzing questions on what we've just done. Leave this slide out. You can pause the video so that everyone can check through their answers for this. I'll see you next time.